The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on communicating impact using data visualization, the 5th webinar of 5 in the Research and Publication Basics series. I am Miriam Nauenberg, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Liz Woolcott. Liz is the head of cataloging and metadata services at Utah State University. She manages the MARC and non-MARC metadata creation of the university libraries and is the co-founder of the Library Workflow Exchange. She publishes and presents on workflow and assessment strategies for library technical services, the impact of organizational structures on library work, and measuring impact for digital content reuse. Liz brings considerable expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have her with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions box on your screen. We will have times for questions after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here is Liz. There will be a slight delay while we change presenters.
Oh, thank you, Miriam. I appreciate that. And thank you guys all for joining me today to talk about data visualization. I'm really excited to talk with you all about this topic because I think it has a lot of broad applicability across the work that technical services units do. So just as a bit of a background, I have worked in cataloging for the last 15 years, but I don't have any graphic design training and just a very minimal amount of statistics training from way back in the day. What I want to show you today is what I and my colleagues here at Utah State University have found really helpful in our work and in our research, despite our lack of training in these areas. There is a lot of potential for creatively using data visualizations to talk about the work that we do every day. And best of all, there are lots of tools that we can use to help us create professionally looking data visualizations, even if you're design challenged like I am. You can create something beautiful or impactful. You have lots of options. Okay, so let's start our conversation by making sure that we're all on the same page here. So let's talk about what is a data visualization, and more importantly, why should we be talking about it? So my own definition of data visualization is information that is interpreted or presented through illustration. We can envision our data or information as a spectrum from the raw data stage through data interpretation and ending up in data presentation. So for example, a couple of years ago, my colleagues Becky Skeen and Andrea Payant and I did a study here at USU to learn about our communication patterns with other units. We began by having our unit track their interactions with everyone outside of our unit, and we put the information into a spreadsheet. So this was our raw data. Next, we began to analyze the data using graphs and charts. This was the data interpretation portion of the visualization, and it helped us to determine where patterns were arising by looking at the data in a visual medium. Finally, we took the most significant findings of that data and reported on it in 2 places, in a scholarly publication and then also to our library administration. So by the end of this process, we had 3 different visualizations for 3 different stakeholders, for ourselves, for other professionals in a scholarly setting, and for our library administration. Each of these stakeholders relied on the same data, but they required something different from the communication or the visualization of that data. So this is what we'll explore throughout this webinar. There are different purposes for data visualization, and that same data will likely need to be honed and presented in different ways to create effective communication. So just as a clarification before we really get into this, almost all of the data and the infographics presented here were created by me. A few others were created by my colleagues within our unit and are being used with their permission, while there are many other kinds of examples out there. other than what I'm presenting here. I chose to only use these because I wanted to be sure I didn't misrepresent the work of others or put them up for critique, which I hope you will do. We really want to dive into what works and what doesn't work about these. So the methods I'll demonstrate here are those that can be applied to other data and infographics that you can see, and you'll literally see them everywhere around yourself. I hope that you'll begin to ask yourself, was that an effective way to reach me? And the more you become aware of the little things that can make or break effective communication, the better off your own visualizations will become. So here's our plan for our hour together. We'll first discuss the two types of data visualization mediums. There'll be data graphics and infographics. And the next we'll go over some tools that you can use to help create data visualizations. So at that point, we'll look at some considerations for best practices in design, and then we'll test out our theories with simple interactive activities. So let's start off with the data graphics versus infographics. Data graphics are necessary to help us interpret raw data. So for example, what I have here is a spreadsheet. This is the first 17 rows of a 24,000 plus list of library material that circulated in 2018 from our library. This was exported from our catalog, and I have to say I love this data. It is immensely rich. It can tell us what subjects are interesting, what the most popular titles are, where the most popular material is located in the library, when it was cataloged, what fund it was purchased with, and so on. Nobody has the time to read through this list of over 24,000 item things. So without some visual interpretation of this data, it's really hard to make much sense of it. Diagrams such as this column graph are the illustrations of raw data. These can be charts and graphs or schematics. They help to demonstrate the data in a visual medium and make it easier to interpret what the data shows us. For instance, this graph here shows which area of the library sees the most circulating material. This type of information can help us with space planning, or with acquisition and collection development, or with understanding patron patterns, or with looking to see if the location has an impact on what was selected for checkout. Ultimately, data graphics help us to illustrate what the spreadsheet on the right struggles to convey. So this graph in particular was created by selecting only two data points from our data set, the location code and the number of checkouts, and then comparing the two with a pivot table, which is a tool that's available in most data analysis platforms like Excel and Google Sheets or Tableau. Pivot tables help you to compare two or more variables together. At that point, once you have a pivot table, you can create the chart using the charting functions of whatever program you're in. If you're unsure how to do that, please don't worry too much. You're in very good company. And in just a moment, I'll show you a link to a step-by-step tutorial that we created here on how to use pivot tables and other simple data analysis methods. And it's much easier than you think. So one thing to note is that there are many ways to represent data in data graphics. Here we see the circulation by location data represented as a column graph that we just showed on the previous slide. In this view, you'll see it as a tree map, where the size of the box indicates how large the data is compared to the other categories. This is the same content as our column graph, but just represented slightly differently. Once again, here's the exact same data as a pie chart. As you can see, some formats are more pleasing to look at or easier to read, and some chart formats are more informative. Which one you choose depends on the best way to communicate your information. So these are just 3 ways to communicate that information, and you can see some are more effective than others. There are lots of others. So while graphics like these are really useful for helping to interpret and get a grasp of the data, you need to be aware of using them in all of your communication efforts. You need to consider which ones are easier to read or understand, how much time the audience has to process the information. Do they have enough knowledge of the variables you're presenting to understand them outright, or will they need some context? Also, are you showing this on a screen or on paper, and what is the size? So let's put this into some context. If you're using this graph to communicate with a patron or someone outside of the library field, or even someone outside your library, this might not resonate with them. They may not be familiar with the locations or what those locations mean, but if you're using this to demonstrate information to folks who work in your library or to your library administration, they'll have a lot more contextual understanding. Likewise, if you're presenting data in the form of a scholarly article, these kinds of graphs can help back up your writing or help communicate with colleagues. And these audience types, the supervisor or fellow library employees or other colleagues in the profession who are reading your work, will have a general understanding of the context and be prepared to sit down and do some of the intellectual work in interpreting the charts. Because these types of graphs require the audience to do some of the heavy lifting, to mentally break them down to understand the data. They're meant to be to represent data in a way that people can analyze or interpret it. So let's compare that with the visualization meant for presentation or easier digestion of information. Infographics are one step further on the spectrum of visualizations. They take the most important parts of the final analyzed data and present it quickly in a way that's easy to digest, it's creative, or that's pleasing to the eye. These are the most commonly used with external audiences, ones that are not involved in the data collection or may not have the context to parse the more detailed graphs. But they can also be used with just about any audience. Here's an example of part of an infographic that was created by Andrea Payne, our metadata librarian, using the circulation and location data that I showed you already. This takes data from the graphs that we just saw and lays it over a schematic of our library floor plan with a heat map that shows which areas of the library see the most circulation. Note that the audience for this was our fellow library colleagues, so the floor plans are easily recognizable. To you, it will likely take a bit longer to decipher and digest the infographic. But one of the best practices is always to build an infographic to the level of knowledge your audience has about a topic. Make them do as little work as possible to understand it. Here's another example of an infographic. This one is a bit more complex and it regards an entirely different topic than the circulation material, but it's built in the traditional style of infographics. This one compiles data points into one argument and tries to persuade the audience of its point. This was created to help talk to the residents in our area, along with our county council to help support the local bookmobile and county library. As you can see, infographics tend to be more focused on narratives rather than interpreting or analyzing the data. Okay, so just to sum up at this point, I hope the difference between data graphics and infographics are clear. Data graphics are generally presented as charts, and they require your audience to have some contextual knowledge and do some of the heavy lifting to interpret information. They're best used for analyzing or understanding data. Infographics, on the other hand, take the most important information and represent it as icons or small bite-sized pieces of information. They require as little contextual knowledge as possible and should only need minimal interpretation of images. They're best used in a narrative format. Okay, so now that we've covered the two basic types of data visualization, let's talk about some tools you can use for creating them. Before we go any further, I just need to acknowledge the extensive work of Andrea Payne and Becky Skeen, who worked with me to create a large portion of this section of the presentation. This is on tools that you can use to create data graphics and infographics. So the three of us gave a pre-conference at ALA last year that focused on data visualization. As part of that, we created step-by-step guides, tutorials, and rubrics, and we have them up at our institutional repository for anyone who wants to use them. The link is here. And if you remember my point about the pivot tables, this is the guide that will walk you through how to do them. In this section on tools as we go through, I'll highlight a couple of the resources we included in this tutorial, but as we only have an hour together, I won't be able to go into more depth. However, you're welcome to download this tutorial and try it out for yourself, and I'll also post this link again at the end of the webinar. So in that tutorial that I just linked to are two rubrics, one that looks at data analysis and one that looks at infographic tools. Right here is the one for the data analysis tools. So there are a wide range of tools you can use for data analysis and interpretation to create data graphs for use in scholarly work or just in reporting to supervisors and library personnel. Presented in this rubric are the data analysis interpretation tools and platforms such as Data Hero, Data Wrapper, Data Studio, HighCharts, Lyra, Quadrigram, Raw Graphs, Google Sheets, and Tableau. When creating this rubric, we focused on only those platforms that offered some kind of free version. There are a lot of additional software and platforms that do wonderful things, but we wanted to explore those that did not present a substantial cost barrier. So we evaluated the platforms for common needs such as ease of use, whether there was a wide variety of charting options, if material would dynamically update, whether it included embedding and sharing options, dashboards, export options, cloud storage, permanence, team sharing and collaboration, and watermarking. And you can see our ratings here. For data analysis tools to create data graphics, some clear standouts were Google Sheets, Data Studio, and Tableau. Each of these tools provides a robust way to import and analyze data, and some have a higher learning curve than others. But of these, I'm just going to show you some features for Google Sheets in particular because it's really simple to use. So to use Google Sheets, you just need any Google sign-on, whether personal or institutional. Google Sheets functions very similarly to Excel and has many of the same key features, including some additional robust add-ons, such as mapping features. Along with this is the ability to share and work collaboratively with others. So here's an example of the circulating material data that I used to compile the graphs and infographics that we've seen so far. It includes a lot of variables such as record numbers, titles, call numbers, material types, location, checkouts, and so on. As I mentioned earlier, creating the graphs that we saw already is basically a three-step process. You create a pivot table, you can sort the results, and then create the chart. So pivot tables are as simple as selecting the data that you want and then clicking on the pivot chart option. You can determine which of the columns or rows you want to appear and where. You can determine if you want it to count entries, to sum them, to get the mean or the median. So here's an example of a pivot chart. It took the columns I highlighted from the main data and counted each location code for me and presented it in a nice new table. On the right, you can see that I asked it to put each location code in a new row, and the value I wanted to appear for it was the sum total of the checkouts for each location. I could also change that to be a count of each item in the location that checked out. But since many had multiple locations, I wanted to see the total number of times an item was used. So you can sort and filter easily to see the data line up in a different way. In this case, I asked it to sort in reverse order so that the largest numbers appeared on top. Here's an example of a chart. In Google Sheets and also Excel, all you have to do is highlight the data you want to graph and then select the chart option. From there, you can select which kinds of charts you want. You can change colors, fonts, titles, spacing, and a whole lot of other features to get the image that best reflects your data. Here's a quick zoom in of the examples of other chart options. So you could do a column chart or bar chart, a pie chart, donut charts, scatter charts, mapping tools, tree maps. What is really nice is the ability to switch between them so that you can see what it looks like for each charting option. I think the mapping tools are some of the most interesting visualizations available from Google Sheets. These can be both data graphs and also infographics because of how visual they are. This is just a quick example of a map chart that you can create in Google Sheets with just the city and the state information. You can also get down to coordinate levels or street addresses too. This is an example of an add-on in Google Sheets called GeoCode by AwesomeTable. I really like this functionality because all you have to do is have the city or state information, and it will create a pinned map and tie it all back to your data in a table that you can filter. You can also do this down to the address level too. So if you change any of the filters that you see in the middle, such as year-to-date checkouts, days of the week, location, etc., the map will zoom so you can show just those entries. And you can give different kinds of permission levels to view this data so others can play with the data using the filters without changing the actual data content. Google Sheets has a lot of additional add-ons. I've listed some fun ones here, but there are an extensive number of add-ons that you can explore. I really like the AwesomeTable ones. That's the ones I tend to use the most. Okay, so we're going to pause just for a second here because that was a really quick overview of Google Sheets. The tutorial I linked you to will have step-by-step instructions for doing all the steps we had so far. But I just wanted to pause for a second and see if anyone had any questions so far.
Great, thanks, Liz. To the audience, as Liz mentioned, we have time for questions. We can take 1 or 2 questions at this point. So if you haven't already, please enter your questions into the questions box. And Liz, here's a question for you. Regarding the pivot table, does it always just have 2 variables, or is there a limit to how many variables a person should attempt to show in a table?
There is a limit to what's reasonable, but you can add more, so you can group them. I've done it to 4 levels basically, so there's 2 components each, and each of them are grouped. but I wouldn't go much further than that. In fact, that's really not very useful on its own. 2 to 3 is the best option.
Okay. And next question. Have you seen a growth of use of these interactive visualizations in the library literature?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I could give an accurate accounting for the library literature itself. I have seen them used more by libraries in communicating with each other and also internally within the library, but I don't have a good sense of how often it's used in the, other than just data graphics itself. I do know a lot of their scholarly publications are, as they go online, they're more likely to use your data graphics, but if they have print options, then they you get very limited very quickly.
Great. And one more question. Regarding the data graphics, how many colors should be used? Do you have guidelines on the use of color in charts and graphs?
That's a really good question. And we'll go over some design options at closer to the end. I tend to go with very limited colors, pick 2 or 3 tops. Sometimes you need colors to represent different things in your data graphics, but the more colors you have being represented, the more complex it is to understand. So be very judicious and try to keep it down if possible.
Great. That is it for our questions at this point in the presentation. So Liz, I'm going to turn it back over to you to continue with the presentation.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's look at some of just your visualization tools. This is also another rubric from that tutorial that I pointed out. This one analyzes the infographic tools that are available to you. And so for this analysis, we looked at BeFunky, Canva, Easily, Infogram, Pictochart, Snappa, Venngage, Visme, and VisualizeMe. So for each of these platforms, we looked at how easy they are to use, what their graphics inventory look like, the template options, the number of projects that could be held in an account, if it could be used for more than just making infographics, if there were options to not watermark the images, how good the exported files looked, and if there were team editing options, and also if you could share easily on social media. And the truth is most of these came out very similarly to each other. But I will highlight one of them for you, Visme, because that's the one that we have the most long-term usage with, but some of the others work just as well, particularly Canva had a lot of equal features to it. So this is what your project dashboard in Visme looks like. It keeps all of your projects in one place so that you can edit, print, or download quickly. In order to create a new infographic, you have the option of using templates or starting from scratch. So since I mentioned already, I have very little talent for design. I prefer to use these templates and then switch them to meet my needs. So they have templates for presentations, infographics, documents, printables, web graphics, social graphics, and then you can customize. So here's 2 examples of graphic templates from their infographic section. Every piece of these templates is movable. You can change the color schemes, you can add elements, change icons, change data graphs, import your own images, and your own branding if you need. So I'll just quickly show you some of the options. In the image on the left, you can see different types of font styles and also font groupings that complement each other, which is really nice for me as somebody who's design challenged to see what goes well together. On the right, you can see different ways that you can show stats and figures. These are plug and play elements that you can select and drag or drag and drop to your preferred location. Once it's there, you can adjust it to fit your needs. So you can change the number of human icons, for instance, to meet the need or what you're trying to emphasize. You can also change them, their colors, whether they show male or female. You can also make it fit the data that you want to represent. Similarly, you can add graphics that are paired with text, such as you see on the left, or you can add just straight graphics on their own. Just as a note, I think these monochromatic graphics or icons work the best. So by that, I'll point you to, if you look at simple icons that are a single color, those tend to work the best in infographics. So you can add data elements that you can change to fit the information you're showing, and you can also change the color scheme by simply clicking on different groupings or different theme groupings. The nice thing about this, it will change all the elements in the infographic so that they match and are consistent, and you don't have to go and rechange those individually. So using these templates and the functions that I just showed, you can change each of the elements in the template to fit your needs. So the example shown on the left here is the basic original template. And on the right is that same template, but with a new color scheme. And it's altered to reflect a technical services report structure that we wanted that would show material types, fund codes, circulation stats, cataloging stats, and interlibrary loan. The data graphic has been changed from a pie chart that you see on the left to a column chart just by editing the chart type. The icons now show books, CDs, and laptops instead of desktops, tablets, and smartphones because we wanted to highlight the books, CDs, and laptops. And it highlights the amount of, we've added additional spaces below to show the fund codes that are used, to highlight the amount of cataloging, and also to show a cool map where interlibrary loan books have been sent. And these were all created with customizable plug-and-play interface. So you just click on something and drag it and change the numbers and it pops. Okay, so that's VisMe, and that's just a really quick tutorial. And like the Google Sheets, our tutorial that we have linked has step-by-step instructions for how to make this tech services report. But do you guys have any questions about VisMe in particular or any other infographic tools?
Okay, Liz, I have a question here. Are there any recommendations for the type of data graphics that should be used in the infographics? So I guess types of charts, I guess, or maybe pie charts versus, line charts. What do you find works best with the infographics?
So that's
or is there anything?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. The more simple your graph is, the better off you're going to do. So any of your graphs will work as long as you're not making them overly complex. So your column charts, so we showed changing your pie charts to a column chart. As long as your pie chart only has a couple elements, it's fine. Or if your column chart only has like 2 to 3, 4 elements, that's fine. If you need big, long elements, that's going to get, you're going to need to find a different way to represent that. So it really just depends on the type of data, but most of the charting options will work. Line graphs and scatter plots do not tend to work as well. It takes more in the way of actual interpretation trying to do that.
Great. And next question. Would it be acceptable to have presentation mixed between data graphics and infographics, or would that look strange?
So I guess that depends on your context. So a lot of infographics do pull in data graphics, but once again, it's very simplified. If it's for like a conference presentation, you can definitely mix them. If it is within a scholarly article, it depends on the structure and how it's matching up with your content. So the context will actually kind of determine that, which is not very helpful to the questioner. I apologize.
Oh. Okay, I think that's it for our questions now, Liz. So I'm going to turn it back over to you to continue, and we'll wait for the questions at the end if anyone has anything else.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. All right, so we're about halfway through our plan so far. So we've covered data graphics and infographics and some tools that you can use. But let's go on to some best practices, design best practices, especially since a lot of you have kind of asked those questions already. You're thinking in that mindset, which I think is awesome. Okay, so this is a fun little, hopefully fun little schematic I put together for how I think about design. So if you ask yourself, what amps up your design? Best practices for designing both data graphics and infographics come down to 4 main elements or questions. Understanding your audience, focusing your message, designing for your platform, and creating simple designs. So we're going to look at these design elements in groups because audience and messaging generally go hand in hand, as do platforms and simple designs. Okay, so first of all, and this is going to come as no surprise to you all, but you need to know who you're designing for. Audience and messaging are two sides of the same coin. So who is your audience and what do you need them to know? The more specific you can get, the better off your design will be. Knowing who your audience is will help you with your messaging and the decision about what to display in your visualization. So ask yourself what they absolutely need to know, both to be able to interpret your information and also to keep the message focused on only the most important of your takeaways. Tony Haley, in his Time Magazine article, outlined some key information for websites and online engagement data. One thing that he noted, and this is really important, is that most people spend less than 15 seconds looking at reading through any web page. This was back in 2014, and by more recent accounts, it may be even less than that. So given your time constraints, consider what the most important message is for your audience. What do they absolutely need to take away from your data? And then work backwards. So consider yourself like a journalist writing an article, with the key information coming first, followed by the supporting information. Always assume that your audience will not read or digest your entire infographic or your data graphic, no matter how pretty it is. You will need your point to come across quickly and simply, and preferably be above the fold, which in online terms means that they are before someone is required to scroll down. Consider your audience's experience, both their life experience and what their experience will be when they're seeing your visualization. For instance, if you're at a children's section in a public library or school, little things like the reading level of your audience will impact your design in a big way. Consider where your audience will likely be when they see your design. Will they need large text if it is viewed from a distance, or will they need some contextual cues? For instance, if you're designing a visualization for a scholarly article, your article will clue them in about what you're demonstrating, but if your graphic is removed from that context, does it still make sense? Is there enough information without being too much information? Which is a really hard medium to kind of hit. Also consider the amount of time your audience will spend on your visualization. If it's on a web page, you don't have that much time to get your point across, so you're 15 seconds. So keep the message succinct and clear. And always match the graphics, the format, and the mediums you plan to use to the time your audience has to spend on the design. As we've noted all along, be clear with what they should do with the information. If the idea is just to know the information, that's fine. But if you want an action to occur, state that very clearly and very early. So let's return to the example of the circulation information in our data graph. All graphs should have a clear title and a label. Only focus on the most important information, although with data graphics, you have a lot more leeway to include a wider amount of info. So for instance, you can shorten this graph to only include the top 5 locations if you're trying to point out your most popular spots. Or you can include everything if you need to see the wider landscape of how your space is used for planning purposes. If this is your best representation for your audience, you will likely expect that they will do some of the interpretation. For instance, they'll have to note that the second floor south end of the building is almost twice as popular as the floor above it. We're going to expect them to do a little bit of work here. But let's look at the example of the bookmobile infographic. This was one of the earliest infographics I put together, and I learned a lot from creating and distributing it. One thing was that my message was not really cutting libraries affects everyone that I put at the top. It was contact the county council and say no to cutting libraries, but I buried that at the end. Additionally, my messaging needs to be tighter. Through asking residents after this event was over, the most important thing to them was the cost, the $1.25. I should have put that further to the top. I could have gotten rid of what the bookmobile provides because that didn't resonate with the community, but the support to daycares and schools did. Additionally, the number of towns without a library was interesting to them. I chose to represent it in 2 graphs though, but one would have sufficed and saved space. So state your purpose clearly, focus on the most important things they need to know or what would resonate with them, and test that message with the audience members whenever possible. So let's switch to platforms and simplicity. These are heavily dependent on your messaging and audience, and they influence them in return. It can't be overstated that the platforms you intend to present your graphics on should drive a lot of your design decisions. You will need to know the limitations. If you're messaging online, you may need to consider the size of mobile screens or the proportion limitations of the social media platforms you will use. For instance, Instagram takes a square shape versus the others, and that kind of may throw you off. For print material, the size of your final printing and the size of fonts will be important, particularly. Also consider if you want others to be able to share it, and especially if they share it across multiple platforms, that will make it a little bit trickier for design. On the actual design, Simple goes a long way. Use a consistent and complementary color scheme. This is really important. Consider your own branding needs when you do this. If you have a beautiful purple-based color scheme, but your library branding is a clashing orange, it may not work out well. With font types, you can mix them up a bit, particularly with infographics, but without going too wild. Icons can be used to bring consistency to a design. So if you have the solid monochromatic icons I was pointing out earlier, but they're interspersed with images or pictures, your design won't look very tight or organized. So be sure to keep text to a minimum and use icons to represent ideas. This can get tricky and will depend on your audience though, so use the icons that they recognize. You don't want them to wonder what your images are referring to. And again, always consider the time limitations of your audience. If they can't understand your visualization quickly, they most likely won't understand much of it at all. So showing our data graphic with the platform and simplicity elements in mind, be sure to use consistent color that is easily visible. If you choose to have each element represented by a different color, you'll need to make them stand out from one another and provide a legend to help understand them. But this gets very difficult. Try to use simple colors. Use the font that's readable for the size that your data graphic will eventually take. Choose the best graphic representation for your data and test out multiple in order to see that. You can even ask intended audiences which one they understand fastest. And then and always be able to test it out in the environment too if you can. So print it out if it's going to be printed. So for our infographic example, consider again that the platform and environment it is presented in. A vertical design like this may be too big for computer screens or TV monitors. Keep your focal points in consistent colors, bold colors to draw the eye to the most important points. Make sure your color scheme is visible on a platform. Use just a handful of colors. Use simple icons and let your information flow in a narrative format if that fits your messaging, and use blank space to help highlight your main points and avoid being too busy. Okay, so now that we've covered some very basic design practices, let's test out your AMPS recognitions. So on the following slides, I'm going to show you 4 visualizations, and I'm going to give you 15 seconds to view each one. And then I'm going to ask you a specific question related to the AMPS design principle we just discussed. So this exercise is meant to show you in real time what your design will need to accomplish. So just as a fair warning, in many of the cases, the designs will fail, so just expect that. Use your critical lens to examine why, so that you can avoid the pitfalls that I found. So remember that you have 15 seconds to look at the design. So get ready to answer a poll. It should be pretty quick clicking. And then our amazing Wanda, who is providing our tech support today, will put up a question poll for you to answer. Okay, here we go. Here's our first design. Okay, I'm going to give you 15 seconds to look at this. And then I will ask you a question. Okay, we're going to stop there. Wanda, can you put up the poll? Okay, so who is this infographic intended for? Is this for library colleagues and administrators? Is it for patrons? Is it for donors or for lucky readers? Okay, so I think we've been about 20 seconds there. Okay, let's look at our poll results. Whoa, that's really small. Okay, so everyone, most of you guys said library colleagues and administrators, yay. And then additional people said patrons. So this is really good. Okay, let's pull back to our slideshow and we'll take this through to our AMPS test here. Okay, so our audience was our colleagues and administrators, and I'm glad you guys were able to see that. And it being in an annual report gives it context, right? So the purpose for creating this infographic was to summarize the key projects that are actually discussed in more in-depth within the rest of the text. So if readers took nothing else away from this message, and let's be really honest, we're really glad that they're even looking at the annual report, then this kind of summary infographic will be helpful in making sure some of the key statistics stick with the reader. However, this infographic could have done better at aligning the icons so that the eye didn't have to scan back and forth. Also, while the color scheme is consistent, some of the text could use lighter colors to make them stand out better, particularly when it's printed. So those are just some ways to kind of look at that between the audience, the message, the platforms, and the simplicity. So let's do our next one. Are you guys ready? I'll give you 15 seconds to look at this one. Okay, we're going to stop there. Wanda, can you put up our poll? Okay, so now answer this question. What was the main point of this infographic? Was it the number of doctoral cataloging units? Was it the staffing breakdown for cataloging units at doctoral institutions? The number of respondents for survey questions? Or the levels of despair related to backlogs? Okay, so hopefully you all have had a chance to answer that. Let's see what our results are. Okay. So good, 100% of you guys got this. Yay, staff breakdown for cataloging units at doctoral institutions. Okay, so let's leave our poll results and come back. So if we take our AMPS test here, our messaging was to break down the levels of cataloging units in doctoral universities. So this was an infographic I created with a research project, partner Jeremy Minty, on the structure of cataloging units in academic libraries. I threw this one in here because it kind of breaks the norm for what I've been showing you so far. The audience for this is librarians and administrators because, well, let's face it, who else would really be interested in this? But rather than appearing in a scholarly article, this was put online as part of a website that we put together for the project. So it showed a very small, very particular set of data, and it was made for sharing on the website and possibly somewhere, anywhere elsewhere if people wanted to. The color scheme is good because it's consistent and matches between the two graph types, but it does require a lot of contextual digging and interpretation, which is not usually done with infographics like this. So unless you're in the context of the website, you may not know what this is supposed to be about. And however, once you post an image online, it can be shared or indexed in ways you didn't anticipate. So being prepared for that, if you can, is really important. Okay, let's do our next one. I'm gonna give you 15 seconds to take a look at this. Squint really hard. But don't give yourselves headaches. Okay, so we're going to stop right there. And Wanda, can you put up our next poll here? Okay, so what is likely to be the biggest challenge in posting or printing this infographic? Will it be that it's too long to see on a screen? Will it need a 15-foot tall wall to hang on? Is it both 1 and 2? Or is nothing? It's perfect in every way. Give you guys a chance to log in your answers. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to put in your answers. Let's take a look at our results. Okay, so our biggest challenge is both 1 and 2 actually. So most of you guys got that, which is awesome, but it's also definitely too big to be seen on a screen, which you're struggling with right at this moment. Okay, let's go back to our slideshow here. Okay, let's look at our AMPS test on this. So this beautiful infographic, it actually looks really stunning at 100%. It was created by our talented Andrea Pant for a luncheon that we did with our administration, and it was one of the very first infographics that we created. But we found out after designing it that it would take 15 feet to show this if we printed it out at the correct scale, which also means it's really, really hard to see online. So most of the content is what we call below the fold. If you could read this on your screen, you would see that it started with a great message for our library admin and colleagues about the challenges for cataloging, and also all the amazing ways we're meeting those challenges. And it's great for white space and icons, and the layout flows really well. Our only downside is just being able to see it all together. Okay, we have one last demonstration. Let's give you 15 seconds to look at this one. Okay, we'll stop right there. Wanda, can we put up our final poll? Okay, so why are there both pie charts and bar charts on this graph? Is it to compare the actual results with expected results? Is it to demonstrate time differences? Is it to show the same data in 2 visualizations, or to make it look fancy? Okay, let's see what you guys all thought. Can we put up the results? Okay, so most people anticipated that it was to show the same data in 2 visualizations, with some people that it was to compare the actual and expected results. And that's what it was intended to do, was the actual versus expected. So this is a data set that was part of a study that Andrea Pant, Becky Skeen, and I conducted on interactions between cataloging units and other units in our library. And it includes all the data for how often we actually interacted with another department, and then how often they thought they interacted with us. So in putting the 2 variables together, we were trying to do a comparison. But where could we have improved this? Well, I could improve this because I'm the one who made this one up. But since this was for a scholarly publication, we can anticipate that our readers would take more initiative with the interpreting data. The color schemes are fairly simple, so that helps with the messaging, but the data is not intuitive to read through. So changing the icons to be consistent instead of comparing column chart with a pie chart would have been more effective. And also displaying the most significant results instead of all of the results would probably have been the best option. So simplifying the interface for people, even if we expect them to do more work in the interpretation. So thank you for participating in this whole, oh, I'm sorry, can we take down the results? I'll just put this back up. So that was our AMPS test there on the top right there. But thank you for participating in our demonstration. So I hope that it brought home some of the key points for data visualization design. It's really important that we think like our audience, that we create succinct messaging, that we plan for our platform constraints, and that we use simple designs. And then we keep in mind that our audience will not spend much time on this. So it's time is really important throughout this whole process. But mostly importantly, with the tools that we have and with just trying to get our head into our audience's heads, we can all do this. You all have the option. So this is a list of just the resources I have. On the second one is the link to the tutorial we were talking about, but the rest of them are really good reading if you want to think from a design perspective. And that is all I have.
Great, thank you, Liz. This has been a very, very interesting session, and I'm sure we all appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. So folks, we now have time for questions. If you have not done so yet, please enter your questions in the questions box, and we'll take a few minutes for our final questions here at the end. Liz, here's a question for you. In the visualizations you have studied or seen, what seems to be the greater challenge, including too much information or not enough information? What should beginners be careful of?
I think the first inclination is to include too much information because you know what's interesting to you, but not always what's impactful for your audience. So I think first constraining yourself to it, what the most important pieces are. But then second to that is actually going to that audience and seeing if they can understand it. And then that's what provides you with the contextual clues that you take for granted, that they may not know. And so that two-step process of just really honing down to if I had to pick one thing, what do they need to take away from this aspect to it, and then testing it with them.
Great. Next question. Can you put the slide with the tutorial URLs back up?
Yes.
Great. Okay, next question. Can you comment on accessibility in data visualizations? Are there any tips for designers to be aware of?
So that's a really good point and one of the harder things to do, I think. But I think it's really important all the way around. So if you've ever taken, particularly your online material and run it through screen readers, that's a really good idea of contextualization of things that you take for granted. So being able to label images, being able to provide short descriptions of what you're posting online in addition to the actual image itself, those are some really quick key things you can do. And a lot of your programs allow you to do alt text, which helps you to identify your images. But those are, I think it's really key to put yourself in the context of the people who might be using this. That really helps to clue you in on additional things that you can do to improve how accessible, how understandable it is to your audience.
Great. Next question. Are there trends in visualization to be aware of? Overuse of this or that, etc.?
Oh, that's a really good question too. I think anytime people use anything for extended periods of time, then that's what gives you kind of the overuse feeling. Infographics themselves can sometimes be way overused, particularly if you're trying to shove a lot of data into them. I think people like the idea that they've made it into a pictorial design, and so they automatically think it'll resonate with their audiences when it won't. So you don't want to do too many of them, but anytime you could use imagery to help highlight something, particularly if you're text heavy, that kind of helps. Trying to think of other trends. I can't think of anything right off, but I'll continue to think about that.
Great. Next question. Review standards for visualizations. Is it good for others to review or check your work?
Absolutely. The more people that you can get to check it, particularly anyone who's in your audience, that's the key, is to get their viewpoint and their feedback, or members of that beforehand. But anybody else looking at your material will help.
Great. And next question. The first AMPS example had icons bounce back and forth from left to right, which was cited as an example of something to avoid. But the really long AMPS example had this design as well. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so part of the thing was the amount of space that you have around it. And it really is good to line up your icons. Sometimes you do need them to balance each other so that you don't have images just one side and text on the other. But in this case, we actually squished them pretty closely together. So you had to kind of read back and forth in order to truly get it. In the other ones, you had the what we call a data and text together that was more naturally grouped and also corded off by some of the line drawings around them. So it was more obvious that it was its own unit, whereas the other one just had text that was floated off into the black space, if that makes sense. So being able to make discrete spaces for things is really good instead of trying to fit it just wherever you have openings.
Great. The next question, are word clouds still a thing? It's interesting. Good question.
It is a really good question. I I think word clouds can be used in sub-methods. So for instance, we just did some word clouds here recently based off of a hashtag event we did, and we did it just as a way to kind of sum up the event. Another example here from our library is we did a asked the students about what they wanted to improve with the library, and then we took all of their responses and made a word cloud out of it and then posted it in the space where we had asked them to provide feedback. So it wasn't meant to actually be a data analysis, it was just meant to be a fun way to represent that we heard you. And I think that's a really good use of it. If you're looking at it as a way to really analyze things, I think it's more fun than it is practical. So
great. And we have time for one more question. So here's this question. Would you say that the difference between infographics and data visualization is that infographics make the conclusion for the reader and tell them?
yes, absolutely. So data graphics are more about here's the data, and you may actually come to conclusions from it, but it allows you the option to interpret and look at it yourself. And in all honesty, when you're doing the data crunching beforehand, you've already sculpted your data around certain points, so you're kind of doing it, but it's behind the scenes. But infographics really are, this is what you need to know, this is what my argument is, and I don't want you to have to do the intellectual work here. You just have to know this information or act on this information.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. This has been just wonderful. We're glad that you could all be with us today. That's it for our questions. So we're going to conclude here with the presentation. We're glad you could be with us today. You'll all soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording. You now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will also be in the email. Thanks again to our presenter, Liz Woolcott. Thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Wanda Jazieri and Iping Chen Gaffey, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. The webinars scheduled for May 15th and May 29th constitute our Standardizing Serials series. Please see the ALCTS website to register or to find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be May 21st on changing ideas, roles, and organizational structures in collection and technical services. Please check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.